Brian, Lois, Chris, Meg, Stewie, Brian, Stewie, Chris, Quagmire.
Yo, what's going on, guys? It's Alien 7 months later here. Today, I'm going to be doing some more 3D modeling, and you guys really did seem to like the last video, which, thank you, by the way. The compliments that you gave me were really nice and motivate me to continue making videos like this, so if you'd like to see more, well, you already know what to do. So in my last video, not even in my last video, even the video that I made previous to that, you guys mentioned, oh, well, these would be really cool to see in-game, like specifically in a PvZ shooter. I've done that before. I have friends who can help me get that process done, so that way I don't spend a shitload of time working on these videos. Because in case if it isn't obvious enough, these videos take a lot of time to make. It's why the editing in both of these videos haven't been as good as, let's say, the BFN picnic video. And that's just because it takes me a long time to make these videos. Not necessarily that making these models should take this long. A professional would get them done in a professional amount of time, but I'm not a professional. I have to go out of my way to learn things like anatomy, so that way when I make characters like Cardio Zombie, the anatomy doesn't look stupid as hell. There's also just things that happen, right, where sometimes I'm like demotivated, and so I work on things less when I'm not working for someone, I'm working for myself. My schedule tends to be a little bit more flexible than it probably should be in reality, but I guess at the end of the day, the job gets done. However, you guys asked, and you shall receive. In this video, I'll be making characters, this time in the Battle for Neighborville art style, and I'll be putting these characters in Battle for Neighborville, which I think is really cool because Battle for Neighborville is the game that just doesn't get that much attention when it comes to modding. Alright, so the first character I decided to start off with is Sunshroom. The reason why I chose Sunshroom is because it's a relatively simple character, and I think it's a really great introduction to the BFN style. So, for starters, I guess I'll talk about the actual sculpting part of BFN, right? So, in layman's terms, BFN is a blocky looking game. Now, not at every single turn is the game's art style blocky, right? The game doesn't look like Minecraft or anything like that, but it's similar to games like, let's say, Fortnite, even Overwatch shares a similar aesthetic in some regard, where you have these sharp edges which end up creating a blocky look. This is most notable in things like the zombies, for instance. When you take off their head prop, you can look at the back of their heads and yeah, look at those sharp angles. It looks really blocky. But then you look at their face and it's not all blocky, like there are smooth parts. But, you know, like with Superbrain's jawline, for instance, you can see it's pretty sharp. But then if we look at something like Citron, that's not sharp at all. It's pretty smooth here. But then you look at the eyebrows and, oh, well, the eyebrows have a little bit of sharpness there. So it varies, and it kind of depends on the character design you're working with. Ultimately, it boils down to what you want to convey. How do you want the feel of the character to be? And so bringing it back to Sunshroom, Sunshroom isn't very blocky. It's a very puffy looking character, and especially in games like PvZ Heroes, for instance, the character grows and it looks very, puffy. And so you don't want to use sharp edges as much because you want to retain that soft, puffy look. And so we use it lightly here. We only use it in a select few areas, and as you'll see later on in this recording, underneath the mushroom's cap, specifically the transition between the sides of her cap and then the bottom of the cap, you'll see that it's a sharp angle. Around the eye sockets are sharp. And if you even felt like it, you could get away with maybe making the mouth have some sharp angles. Now, I don't think I went with that approach, because you don't really need to do that, but it's an option you have. And so, like I said earlier, it varies dependent on like the character design you're working with, and we'll explore more complex character designs later on in this video, but for the time being, I think this is a pretty good introduction into what the BFN art style is at a very surface level. So now let's get into textures. BFN has a lot of fun with it, and contrary to popular belief, BFN is actually relatively optimized when it comes to its textures. The game in general is not an optimized game. The game runs like absolute dog shit. It runs far worse than it actually should, but it's not really because of the game's textures or visuals or even art style. I think in some regards it might be, but generally speaking, that's more of a problem with like loading things into memory, what parts of the map are loaded, things like that. Now, I'm not really too well versed with that kind of stuff because that's kind of not my department. But in terms of like the actual models and how they handle like saving space in the game, space as in like the actual like memory, you know, megabytes, gigabytes, that kind of thing, they do a pretty good job of that in the art department. They actually go the extra mile to use shaders in a lot of areas of the game because now they don't have to waste space on textures, just use shaders instead. And yeah, it works pretty well. And the characters with Battle for Neighborville are no different to this. I mean, for crying out loud, the eye shaders for the zombies are not textures. They use a normal map for it to define the shape of like the iris and the pupil, and they do the same thing for the plants as well. Not all of them, not all characters do this, but like most of them do, at least the playable ones do. But this doesn't inherently mean that it's unoptimized because they used a texture. It's still relatively optimized, and they are given a lot of customization with this. To put it into perspective, the plants have different kinds of eye shapes, they have different kind of colors. They only really needed to create like maybe a handful of textures, and you get so much variety out of just these textures. In addition to that, you can also have different variation with the same kind of eye shader and texture. Point in cases, Foot Soldier versus the general, what's it again? I don't remember the name, but it's the 80s action hero skin that like looks all metallic, it looks like the robot 80s. They didn't have to create a new texture for this. They could just recolor it by changing the values. It also allows them to do fun stuff like this, where when Foot Soldier takes damage, you can see that his pupils dilate. Like, that's a pretty cool detail that would take more effort with textures than it would have just making a shader with it, right? Like, this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. It enables you to be able to do a lot of these kinds of things, and it's very optimized. So, now that we know this, how does BFN optimize the textures? Because, yeah, sure, it's cool they use shaders left, right, and center, but the textures, they still use them, don't they? Yes, they do. They 100% do. So how do they optimize them? It's kind of complicated, so for me to explain how they optimize the textures, let me tell you how they combine textures. So there are different kinds of texture maps, right? You have the one that's known by most people, color textures, or a diffuse texture, right? This is just the raw color of something. You see this all over the place with Minecraft and its texture packs. That's pretty much what they are. They're just color textures. Minecraft is a very simple art style, mechanically and technically speaking, so there's not much else to do with it except mess around with the color textures. When you start getting advanced with that game's textures is when you start looking into shaders for that game and that kind of stuff. That's where it gets texture heavy, but the game normally doesn't go too crazy with the textures. It's just a simple color texture to my knowledge. However, there are different kind of texture maps. There are normal maps. Pretty much what a normal map does is it manipulates how light reflects off of a surface. So it makes something that isn't 3D seem 3D. A prime example of this is if we take a look at All-Star's clothing. If I get rid of the normal map, this looks completely flat. Apply it, and now look at his jersey. It has all of this detail, and none of it is 3D. And you would never know because the camera is far away enough and the details are small enough to the point where it looks good enough. It gets that idea out there. And this is very nice because it makes it so that way the model itself doesn't have to be overly detailed. We don't need to spend this much vertices on creating these details. Just put it on a texture. And it looks fine. It works very well. This is common practice though. This isn't just like a BFN exclusive thing. Most games do this. We've been doing this since like either the PS2 or the PS3 era, right? We've been doing this for a minute, so it's nothing new. I'm just saying it to explain it. And there are different kind of texture maps as well. Again, like it's not just normals. There's also the ambient occlusion. There's a metallic one that determines how metallic part of the model is. Roughness, which determines how shiny something is. So on and so forth. And these are a lot of textures to make, right? And for these to have to be their own individual textures would be consuming a lot of space because there are so many models in the game. Most of these have each of these texture maps. You know how much space you're wasting with that? That is a lot. That is a lot of space being spent on the textures. So what does PopCap Vancouver do to cut down on this? And it's not just a PopCap thing. Other developers do this. I'm just explaining specifically what they did in BFN because, I mean, it's a BFN video, go figure. So what they do is they combine these textures into the RGB channels of a texture, or of an image in this case, right? It's not even like a texture thing. This is just an image, right? Pretty much you have RGBA, red, green, blue, and then alpha. Alpha determines the opacity of something, so how transparent, how opaque something is. And so how does this work? Pretty much what you can do is you can take something like, for instance, if we take a look at the CoF texture, what is this made up of? This is made up of the curvature map, roughness map. I think BFN doesn't use roughness. I think it uses smoothness, so you would invert the roughness. It's kind of confusing. I'm not going to explain why. I don't even know why they did this. There's probably a reason, but that's what it is. Then metallic, and then finally emission. And what happens when you do this is you end up with a texture that looks very colorful. And so you might look at this and go, okay, well, that's a lot of colors. Wouldn't that fuck up how the textures work? No, not at all. It doesn't mess up the textures at all. It doesn't matter what the fucking color is. And the reason for this is because all of these textures have one thing in common. They are black and white. They use a grayscale. And the reason why they do this is because the only thing the engine picks up from these textures is the value of them. The value is the brightness. Black versus white. That is all it cares about. It takes these values and then, well, it's a value, so that must mean it's a number of some sort. It'll take that, convert it into a number, a value of something, and that'll then determine how metallic something is. So the higher the value, the more metallic it is. The lower the value, the lower the roughness is, so the more shiny it looks. So on and so forth. And so you can afford to combine these into one texture via the color channels, because at the end of the day, it's not picking up the color, it's picking up the value of it. And how does the game know to pick up what value from where? Well, what the game does is they probably have some kind of shader or material setup where it pretty much breaks down this texture. So behind the scenes, it grabs the textures, it breaks it down, and then says, all right, so metallic. Metallic is in the blue channel because, as we've said before, curvature, roughness, metallic, and then emission. RGB, red is curvature, green is roughness, and then blue is metallic, and then A is emission. So it coincides with the abbreviation. So we know that M, it corresponds with blue. So the game looks at the blue channel and goes, all right, well, there you go, metallic. It takes that and then it gets the value off of it. It doesn't care if the color of it is blue because it doesn't care about the saturation or the hue of it. And it does this for everything else within those color channels. The only time something like this matters is if you're dealing with a normal map or a color map. The color, obviously the color matters for a color map because it's the raw color of something. It needs to utilize RGB. The only one it doesn't really need is A because alpha is opaqueness. It only cares about black and white. Normal map, in BFN, it only really cares about the X and Y, which is the red and green channel. The rest can be whatever for BFN's purposes. And so what BFN does is I think the blue channel uses an ambient occlusion map that gets stuffed in there. And then finally, the subsurface map is put in the color channel, specifically on the alpha, because like I said before, the alpha doesn't matter because that's black and white anyways. Did you get all that? I hope so, because that's pretty much the process that goes into making this game's textures. It's very complicated, but once you learn it, it's clockwork, and you eventually develop like a pipeline for it that makes things easier. You can use apps like GIMP to generate these. You can use something more niche called, I think, Texture Remix. That's sole purpose is to make these kind of texture maps. But again, GIMP works fine. You can look up tutorials on it. There are different kinds of ways to combine these textures and different kinds of abbreviations. I think the most common one is RSM, I think, which is like roughness, specular, and metallic, or roughness, smoothness. I actually don't know. I actually don't know, but I know that's like a common one. I think it's RSM, unless it's like something else, like RMS. I don't know. It doesn't really matter what order you do it in. It's just whatever works with the shader you've created or the material you've created and how that material breaks down that texture map. But there you go. That's how it works. Kind of complicated to explain, and it is a little bit complicated to understand, but again, once you kind of like get a hands-on approach, you kind of figure out how it works. Really quickly, by the way, in case you were curious on how I made the under part of the Sunshroom's cap, I pretty much created a curve, gave it some thickness so that way it actually has like a shape to it, messed around with the shape furthermore so I can get it the way I want it looking, and then I used an array modifier and I changed the shape of the array to circle, and you can change the count of it and it'll loop around the origin point of that curve, and then you'll get that effect, which is really nice. And then what I eventually do here is with the retopologized model, the retopologized model doesn't worry about the underpart of Sunshroom's cap. It's completely flat. This detail is going to be baked into a normal, and it'll look perfectly fine in game, because Sunshroom isn't going to be a very big character. It's a potted plant, so it doesn't need to be too crazy. Maybe if this was a character class, maybe a little bit more effort would have to be put into the detailing of it, but again, for all intents and purposes, this doesn't have to be that detailed because it's a smaller part of the game. So I can afford to make it completely flat and then have those details be baked onto the normals. It also just saves us time on retopology because now we don't have to worry about as much when doing it, which, speaking of which, I did do a little bit of retopology for one of the models in this video, and you'll see it when I get to that, but majority of the retopology was done by Verjoinga, and also both Verjoinga and Lucky helped rig some of the characters in this video. I didn't do any of the rigging, they did all of it. It's just, you know, one did one, the other did the other kind of thing, but the point is without them, these characters would have never been in-game in the first place because I just don't have that much time on my hands. So a huge thank you to them for doing that. You can check their stuff out in the link of the description. With that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at how Sunshroom looks like in game. Alright, so the next character I'm going to be working on is Backup Dancer. Now, some of you guys might be asking, Backup Dancer, why him? Doesn't he already exist? And yes, he does, but exclusively in Garden Warfare 1 and 2. He never made his way in Battle for Neighborville. As a matter of fact, none of the alternate browncoat variations made their way into Battle for Neighborville. The only one they have is TV Head, and I think like the Healer Zombie, but that's pretty much it. Not even Newspaper Zombie exists in BFN, and he's like a staple, he's like a classic, you know, like how could you not have that? Funnily enough though, they do exist in the game's files, and they're pretty much done. I think they're a little bit buggy, but these bugs can literally be fixed through modding, like straight up, you can fix it and then they'll work fine. They're just not in the game, and they do lack their own custom model. I don't know if PopCap has like a BFN version of these characters somewhere locked far within EA's vaults, I actually don't know, but they do exist in the game, they just don't have a model. So I thought to myself, well, I'll just go ahead and make the model then. And the reason why I decided to start with Backup Dancer is, well, for starters, Tony Baloney, right? He's kind of a goat. But second off, making a brown coat is actually a lot more useful than you would think. It's not even like a Backup Dancer specific thing. It's just the fact that for me to make the character, preferably I need to have a base mesh of the brown coat. In case you don't know what a base mesh is, it's pretty much a naked version of the character now. Obviously, with this quote naked version, you don't have anything the player wouldn't normally see in the model, so like you don't have to go crazy with detail, you know what I'm talking about. You just need to have the essentials. So like the torso, the arms, the hands, the legs, the feet, and the neck, and then the head, and that's pretty much it. You saw me do the same thing with Cardio Zombie in my previous video, and brown coat is no different. As a matter of fact, there's a lot more applicability with doing this for brown coat than there is a character like Cardio Zombie. Because the thing about Browncoat is that there are so many different variations of the character, and it's not even just limited to Browncoat, but even characters like Foot Soldier use a similar build to Browncoat. As a matter of fact, PopCap probably does have a bunch of naked versions of all the zombie classes that they'll never show you. They're never going to show you them, because if the internet got a hold of them, may God have mercy on all of our souls, but also, well, the player never needs to see them, right? They use this base mesh because it's nice to have access to the whole model, because you never know when you're going to need to show more skin. A good example of this is if we take a look at GW1 and we take a look at All-Star, majority of his body is being covered by his clothing. But what ends up happening when you need to make a character like Wrestling Star, because he shows far more skin, right? Now they would have to go out of their way to create that part of the body, but why? Right? Just preemptively make the whole model, then make the clothing around the model. It's also just useful because now when you're making the clothes for the characters, you can fit the clothing around them. Another use case scenario of this is Foot Soldier and Centurion, and even in smaller aspects that you wouldn't think to guess, like Browncoat versus Backup Dancer. Backup Dancer shows more of his chest, Browncoat doesn't. If we take away Browncoat's coat, you'll see that, well, there's no part of his model that shows enough of his chest to recreate Backup Dancer. That part would need to exist. However, it's not like we have access to that part of the model because, well, we're not PopCat Vancouver, right? We don't have access to those assets. And so, I guess if you want to argue to make Backup Dancer, you technically don't need to recreate the entirety of the Browncoat base mesh. You don't. You could just actually add that chest piece and then make the clothes. You could very well do that. But like I said, the reason why I would prefer to make a full-on Browncoat base mesh is because in the future, I can refer back to this model to make any different kind of zombie. So if you guys were ever to suggest a new kind of zombie, like Chicken Wrangler or something along those lines, that would make my life 10 times easier because now I have a model exactly for that, where I can design and fit the clothing around the model. And you'll see me do that later on. I actually do take quite a long time making the Browncoat base mesh, and this is just because making a model, it's not too hard to do that off of a reference. But what really made Browncoat a challenge here is the fact that I was using a 3D reference, aka the actual model, right? The actual Browncoat model. And I don't know if you guys have ever tried recreating a 3D thing in 3D and trying to make it look one-to-one, but it's really difficult. And maybe if you're insanely good at 3D modeling, maybe you might have an easier time than I did, but like I said, I'm not like a professional or anything, so yeah, this took me quite a while to do. And the reason why I mention this is because I think we have some time to kill. So whilst you guys see that in the background, I'll skip ahead this time just so that way the video doesn't look too fast. I know that in my other video, I felt like the time lapse was a little bit too quick for you to see what the hell I was doing. I actually don't even think it looked that good, so I'm gonna try and refrain from doing that. I'm gonna try and like skip ahead in parts that you don't really need to see. And whilst I do that, I'll be responding to a few comments that you guys asked me in my previous video, comments that I feel like everybody should hear. So Deadly Queen commented on my last video saying that they are so jealous that I can make models from scratch without a reference. What makes you think that? What makes you think that? I definitely used a reference in my previous video. Now, I guess if what you're talking about is I don't need like a reference for the 3D iteration of the character, then yeah, okay, I suppose. But I'm gonna tell you this right now. Had I actually had a concept artist design a 2D concept before I made the model, we could have planned out that character. I'm assuming you're talking about Blast Spinner. They really like how I interpreted the character design into Garden Warfare by giving her like the legs. Yeah, see, like ideas like that could have been more fleshed out had I actually had some 2D artists like help me with that, or if I just did it myself. So don't think that just because I didn't have any concept art to go off of means that all of a sudden that I can skip a step and I'm doing better. Chances are the design of the character isn't as good as it could have been because I chose not to do that. So understand that you're at no disadvantage. Of course, I'll take the compliment at the end of the day. Thank you. But don't think that this is like a thing you're at a disadvantage of. Like, you're not. Believe me. This is not. Typically, you don't want to skip the whole like concept art phase when you're creating a character. You ideally want to have concept art. I just specifically chose not to do it because the whole purpose of that character was to be shown off on a YouTube video. Making YouTube videos takes a while because you have to do the whole editing thing. I do the editing for all my videos. I remember one time in the BFN picnic video, somebody thought that I paid somebody to make the editing in that video. No, I did the editing myself. So no, these videos just take a lot of time. That's why I chose not to make concept art for it. I'm also just not that good of a concept artist. Technically, I'm capable of it, but I just want to model. It just saves time. So Gingerbread asks me, how did I learn shading and what videos do I recommend to watch and what should you do when learning shading? So for starters, I wouldn't really say that I'm an expert at shading. I think that I could still get a little bit better at that. What I usually do when it comes to shading is I usually use shaders to do that for me. I'll set them up and then it'll kind of create shadows in the areas that I'm looking for, and it's like an automated process, and it's nice. Now, you don't want to always crutch on that too much because sometimes shaders don't get the exact results you're looking for. It's a nice base, but it's nothing that's going to get you to the final product. Sometimes you need that, like, again, you need that, like, that hand painted, that human touch, right? The final touches that really make that shading pop. You don't really get that with shaders, at least not all the time. Maybe sometimes it could be good enough, but usually there's going to be like 1 or 2 spots you're going to have to go back in and do manual shading. And shading isn't that hard. I don't really know how to describe it, so instead of me explaining it, I'm going to go and move over to question 2, which is, what do I recommend you watch or do? What I recommend you do, or I guess watch, let's focus on that. What I recommend you watch are YouTube tutorials. I would probably just look up how to do shading for stylized characters, something like that. And make sure you put 3D at the end of it, by the way, or else you're going to get a bunch of stuff for 2D, which it actually could have applicability to 3D. It's just that it's obviously preferred if you watch a video that's for 3D, because it'll cater towards like the specific use case. And so one thing about a lot of these tutorials is that they might be using different software. Now, I guess this is the point of the conversation where we kind of talk about, I guess, like software illiteracy. And what I mean by this is, let's say you click on a video that is using Substance Painter that shows you how to shade characters in Substance Painter, right? Or it shows you how to use like whatever it is you're trying to do with texturing in Substance Painter. However, the problem is that you're using Blender. Thing is you can translate that into Blender. You can translate what they're doing from in Substance Painter into Blender. You know, these apps at the end of the day are capable of having the same end goal, right? It's not the tools that make the art good, but it's the artists themselves that make the art good, right? It's one of those kind of situations. And so whilst it is true that Substance Painter, when it comes to texturing, is better than Blender, it doesn't actually mean that Blender isn't capable of doing what Substance Painter is capable of doing. For example, I know that Substance Painter has a lot of these automated buttons, right? Like for instance, if you want to get polka dots all over your character model, there's like a button for it, right? You can use a thing called a generator to generate that for you. Whereas in Blender, it's not as simple as that. Like they don't just have a polka dot generator. To do that, you need to go into the shader editor and then create a shader for that. But the point is at the end of the day, you made that shader. So now you have the same thing that Substance Painter has. It's just that Substance Painter had a button that did it for you. Blender, you had to go out of your way to make it manually. That's the only difference. It's why Substance Painter is better, because it just saves you so much more time, but it's also better in other areas, like it's better optimized for like baking, and it runs better and blah, blah, blah. Things like that as well. But kind of the big one, like I said, is that it's just a huge time saver because you don't have to go out of your way to learn this stuff because they just have buttons for it. So you can focus more on making the art than the technical side of the art, which is, again, like that's the part that most people try and avoid as much as possible, is the technical side of the art. The technical side of the art is usually the not fun part, especially when you get into technical issues. It's super irritating. But yeah, the reason why I mention this is to just demonstrate that it is possible to watch a Substance Painter video and apply what they did there into Blender. So don't think that just because the video is Substance means that it's not possible in Blender. It is always possible. And so coming back to software literacy, if you don't really understand like what the Blender equivalent of what they're doing in that Substance Painter video is, then it's probably best that you learn the basics first. Before you even bother learning shading, maybe just understand texturing a little bit more. And if not, if maybe you think you're already well versed in that, then I guess you could just look up tutorials that are specifically done in Blender. You could always do that. And sometimes I do that even nowadays, right? Like I still sometimes do that. I just think that you're going to be limiting the kind of like tutorials and advice you can find by relegating it exclusively to Blender content. Like you don't need to be doing that. I think it's nice to get into the habit of not just exclusively looking at Blender tutorials when it comes to like art that doesn't really require technical know-how, right? Like it's not like we're working with like poly modeling, which has like these hyper specific settings that, you know, maybe you would prefer to see a Blender tutorial on. But that's just me. At the end of the day, I'm not an expert at that. If you're talking about like for manual painting, like hand painted stuff, then yeah, that doesn't really matter what software you're using. Is you could look up any tutorial and it'll probably do just fine. Maybe one YouTuber you could watch is Abe Leal. I know that he has pretty good tutorials in that. So now we're going to go ahead and move on over to the clothes for Backup Dancer. One of the really nice things about having a base mesh, I didn't mention before, though there's so many like nice benefits you get from having a base mesh, is now what I can do is I can mask out the part of the body I want, extract that, inflate it, and then now I can use that as a really, really nice and clean base for whatever part of the clothing I'm working with. So the one you're looking at right now is the shirt. And this is very nice because from here on out, it's just about modifying the overall shape or silhouette of the shirt. And I can do this all while maintaining a low poly count for the model, which is really nice because when you're working with sculpts, you usually want to stay in the low poly phase as much as possible because the model is just easier to work with. I guess more specifically, you want to stay in the low poly stage because it allows you to mess with the overall silhouette, the overall shape of the object you're working on. You only want to move over to a high poly count once you're working on the smaller details. So things like wrinkles, rips, and whatever else may come up in that process. However, right now though, I'm not really worrying about that. I'm just mainly focusing on the big shapes. The pants are more or less the same process. I do spend a lot of time making sure that I have the shape right because I'm still getting used to the BFN style, and pretty sure this is my first attempt at making BFN styled clothing. It's actually not very often that I make clothing, so it's something that I'm still, I guess, relatively new to. And so getting used to what parts of the pants should and shouldn't be over-exaggerated is a little bit difficult for me, but I think I eventually figure it out, and I think it looks fine in the end. You know, I just kind of took a look at some of the other clothing in the game, not just relegated to Backup Dancer and GDB2, but just like other characters in BFN in general. Like I take a look at like Scientist. The brown coat is one of the ones I took heavy inspiration off of when looking at the proportions and even how some of the wrinkles should be handled. Disco Zombie was another one I took a look at. Now I don't show it in the recording here. I was viewing these models through Frosty Editor, but that's fine. Like I don't need them to be in the blend file for me to understand how the proportions should work. I'd say the part that I got better at, but could still use a little bit more work on, were the wrinkles. I know that with Cardio Zombie, I wasn't really like happy with how the wrinkles turned out. I think here I did a much better job, but if I had to give myself one critique about the wrinkles is that I think I overdid it. I did too much. But, you know, at least I learned that lesson, so for future reference, I just won't do it as much. It's also nice too, because, you know, the less time you spend with wrinkles, the more time you have to work on other parts of the model. It's also just nice because during the retopology process, for drawing it doesn't have to compensate as much for the wrinkles. Technically, a lot of those could just be flat and could be handled with normals, but ideally when you're making like a retopologized model, you at least want to have some of the wrinkles be a little bit apparent on the retopo, but it doesn't really have to be anything crazy unless you're overdoing the wrinkles like I am. Or if the wrinkles define the silhouette of whatever it is you're working with. That can very well be the case, and probably is the case with a lot of the zombies. You know, the clothing is supposed to look very ununiform and messed up, and that's a very important part of the way they look, so it wouldn't surprise me if that's something you would see very often with the zombies. So when it came to making this, like, I don't even really know what this is called. I'm pretty sure it's part of the pants, so technically it's not a belt, but I'm gonna call it that anyways because I don't really know the name of this. But when it comes to this little belt piece, I decided to protrude it out a little bit further than it should be, and I don't really know if that was a good idea or not. I just think it ended up looking nice just because it's another aspect of the clothing I can over-exaggerate, which I feel like is a BFN thing to do. However, just because it might feel like a BFN thing to do doesn't always mean that it makes sense to do, because again, if the actual pants don't really work that way, then probably shouldn't do it, but it looked nice and I don't really think it's that big of a deal, so it is what it is. Something that was really fun to work with when working on this model was giving weight to the clothes. And what I mean by this is if you see here how the shirt is tucked into the pants, there's a little bit of a bulge around his waist to indicate that the clothes are kind of like being stuffed in there. There's a little bit more volume in that area of his shirt. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, it's really satisfying working with that. It just looks very nice. But it's also very important to make these kinds of details because it's one of those things that make the clothing feel real. And when I say real, I don't mean real as in like, you know, Red Dead Redemption 2 graphics, and that's not what I'm talking about. When I say real, I guess a better term is believable, right? I think this was something that I loosely touched on my last video, where when you're working with this kind of stuff, of course it's not a realistic art style, but you still want it to feel believable. Like when you look at the clothing, it's like, okay, that clothing looks like it works that way, right? It looks right. Despite it being very cartoony and over-exaggerated, I can still believe that the folds and the way that the clothes bend would probably work similar to this in real life. Not saying that the way that I executed the wrinkles here would be how they would work in real life. Like I said, I still think I need to work on my wrinkles. I think I did a better job here than I did my last video, but I do still think that there could be a little bit more work on them. But the point is that they look good enough, at least for the purposes that I'm using them for, which is like a mod. If this was something that was more professional, obviously you would have to pay more attention to this kind of stuff, which I am, but like I said, it's just for like a little mod and a video, and the model's already been made. Ultimately, it's a learning process, and what's more important is finishing the project as opposed to leaving it to rot because you couldn't get one thing right. So when time came for me to work on extra details on the model, I used a lot of poly modeling because I felt like it works better for these kinds of things. So for instance, with the collar, I have an easier time poly modeling it than I do sculpting, which is why I poly model it, right? Eventually you can go back and use sculpting to give it some extra detail that you wanted to before. I don't think I ended up doing that. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I don't actually remember. I guess we'll find out later in the recording. But the point is that for majority of the process, I used poly modeling. And again, you can see here, I am trying to figure out a way to make the collar a little bit more exaggerated than usual because, again, I can't emphasize this enough. This art style really likes to emphasize a lot of these kinds of details. Now, you want to make sure that it's not too crazy because then you start to lose the shape of what it's supposed to be. But you want to do enough of it to the point where it has personality, it has style. You know, it's very important that these things don't look stiff, especially when it's a character like Backup Dancer because his clothing is very baggy. So stiffness is the last thing you want with a character like this. So when I work on the necklace, one of the things I do to save time is I don't actually create a completely new little medallion of the browncoat's face. In Garden Warfare 2 they did that, but it looks really bad, and to be honest, it doesn't matter. It's not like the player's ever going to get close enough to see it, but my way of improving it for the BFN style was to literally just take the actual browncoat head and just flatten it, and then use that as a baseline for the little medallion. And don't get me wrong, it still looks really cheap and goofy when you get really close to it, but in my opinion, I do think that it actually turned out better than how it looked in the original, but that's just my opinion. But I'm not just mentioning it just to say that I prefer how mine looks like over the original. I'm also mentioning this because, again, this is another use case of the base mesh. If I didn't have a base mesh of the browncoat head, I wouldn't be able to do something like this. I mean, technically I would have been able to. I could have just stole the head from the retopologized model, but the idea is that I wouldn't have some of those finer details, like the wrinkles on the forehead. That's something that's baked onto the normal. The sharpness around the eye sockets and on the corners of the head, again, that's something that's baked into the normal detail. There's just a lot of these smaller details that I would normally have to work a little bit more for to get had I not worked off of a sculpt. But because I chose to work off of a sculpt, a base mesh that I made, these are now things that I actually don't even have to worry about as much. So again, it's not the biggest deal in the grand scheme of things, but it's just still cool that you can now save time in these smaller areas, which is far more important than it might seem, but believe me, cutting corners every instance you get when making assets like these is pretty much the name of the game when it comes to creating 3D models for games. Because something that's really important to factor in is that you can't spend too much time on something that the player isn't going to notice a lot, even if it doesn't look that good. So the mustache was also another pretty simple one. All I did was I created a curve, used a mirror modifier, and then I used a circle to define the shape of the mustache. Working with curves is actually very fun because they're non-destructive. And so I pretty much can create a lot of these details at a whim. And if I don't like something, well, I can just quickly modify it without really having to undo any kind of details because, well, I don't really need to undo. I can just delete it and then modify it from there because, like I said, it's non-destructive. I then eventually go back to the other parts of the model and I use a multi-res modifier to increase the resolution whilst maintaining the original shape I already had, so that way I can then add smaller details. So a majority of what these smaller details were just seam lines, but these seam lines do help make the clothing pop. Another detail that I did go back in and add were the rips. And again, the multi-res modifier helps out with these rips because now what I can do is I can now sharpen the I don't know how to describe it, but like the little like triangles that you get when creating these rips, I can sharpen them to get that stylized look. Beyond that, it's just a matter of setting up shaders that I then use as a nice baseline for the textures of the character. I'm able to generate a gradient and then modify it to my liking. And these gradients actually work pretty similar to how they do in Garden Warfare 2. So if you've watched my previous video, It's a similar process here when it comes to messing around with the gradients. Then on top of the gradients, you add whatever main details are a part of the clothing. So in Backup Dancer's case, one of the main details would be the green spots on his pink shirt. Then on top of the green dots, I go ahead and add shadows within the crevices of the wrinkles to give it more depth. And then in addition to that, I also add a little bit of noise so that way the textures don't look too flat. And then finally, I use a shader to define the edges of the shape so that way I can have a nice highlight in areas like the wrinkles, for instance. And then once I'm done with that, I send it off to Virjoingo. We eventually bake the textures, it gets rigged, and then that's Backup Dancer complete. Alright, so the next character we have is Electric Current. I know somebody in my last video asked me for Electric Current, so this one's for you. You also do mention Nurse a Zombie from PvZ, which I don't really know what that is. I have to look it up and check it out, but if that's like a fan game or like a mod or something, maybe for one video I could mess around with that kind of stuff. I know somebody in my last video also suggested, I think it was like some cotton candy zombie from Reflourished. I'm not too familiar with Reflourished, I've never really played it, but I have seen the character and it seems like a pretty cool character, so maybe it could happen for a video. But coming back to Electric Current, much like Sunshroom, the character isn't very complicated at all. It's a very easy one to make. So there isn't necessarily too much to be said about this guy's character design, so I won't delve too much into that in this section of the video. Instead, I would like to talk about another kind of texture. Now I know I've been doing that throughout this entire video, but BFN, like I said, is very texture savvy. And what I'm about to talk about here is probably its biggest gimmick when it comes to textures. And now what I'm talking about are detail mask slices. Now you may or may not have heard about what these things are, but pretty much I'll try and give you my best rundown of it. It's kind of complicated to explain and I don't even fully understand it myself either, but we do use it in the video and you may have noticed characters like Backup Dancer or even Sunshroom, when you get really close to them, you'll notice that they have these extra details to the character. These things weren't things that I made. We just took advantage of the detail mask slices that they used in the game. So the way it works is you will have a thing called a detail mask slice. On the red channel, you'll have a map that determines the intensity of that detail mask slice, so how visible it is. On the blue channel, you'll have a mask. And much like the metallic map and the roughness map, this is also grayscale, and pretty much the game will take a value dependent on the shade of whichever part of the texture it's looking at. However, instead of it just being a simple, it grabs a value and dependent on the intensity of the value, the more intense the effect of whatever that effect is, instead it takes that value, it does some crazy math equation, I don't remember what it is, but there's an equation for it, and then pretty much that equation poops out a number. Now what this number is used for is to fetch a texture. Now what texture does it fetch? Well, in the game's files, there's an array of these very low quality textures. All of these are normal maps, by the way, which if you remember, as I said earlier in the video, Normal maps manipulate how light reflects off of an object, so it makes something that isn't 3D seem 3D. And you have a bunch of these generic patterns. And the reason why they do this is because instead of having to model these details, instead of having to add these details through other means, what they can do is they can take the detail mask slice, color the part of the model whatever shade they're looking for, the game will pick up the value and then attach that pattern over whatever part of the model they want it to. So for instance, if we take a look at the Pia Valence or the Chomper Knight skin, I don't remember the name of that Chomper skin, but if we take a look at them, we can literally see it right here. This chainmail texture is not something they bothered making at all. It's non-existent. They didn't even need to worry about putting it onto the model. It's literally just as simple as coloring this part of the model, whatever shade it needs to be, to then grab that chainmail texture, and then now the chainmail texture is plastered all over this model. And you see this all over the place in the game. You'll see this with Superbrains' clothes, for instance. This like little pattern, if we take it away, look at that, it's completely flat, but if we bring it back, that looks so much better. And it's such a free way of adding details to the characters. I know that if you go to ArtStation, one of the artists, I think it's a technical artist, I don't know actually, but one of the artists, I'll put a link in the description if you're curious, they even talk about how these things are used, and it's really impressive how much it makes these models pop. And when we were creating these models, well, we had to learn how the system works, and whilst we have a rough understanding of how it works, fortunately we were still able to make use of it, and that's what you've been seeing throughout this video. I didn't mention it up until now, but if you take a look back at Backup Dancer or Sunshroom, if you look closely enough, you'll see these details do exist. And Electric Hurt is no different. And you'll notice, because Electric Hurt will have this like bumpy look all over his body that you won't see in the Blender recording, but in game, you'll notice it. It's there, and that's part and due to the detail mask slice. So that's something that's really cool that saved us time as well. We had to spend time learning it, but once we did, well, it was nice for the long run, because now we don't have to worry about these details on our end. We'll just take these textures and then plaster it over our model. It's also really nice too, because now you're saving space, because now you don't have to create different kinds of textures for this kind of stuff. You can just take from the detail mask slice. But yeah, that's pretty much how they work. It was a very, very rough explanation of it. I'm sure that if you do research or ask around, other people could give you a better explanation. But besides that, I did also have to mess around with the in-game shaders, which when it comes to modding isn't very easy to work with because there's a lot of limitations. Hell, there isn't even a proper previewer for the shaders. So if you want to make shaders for a character, well, have fun with that, because it's never easy. But after that was all said and done, we have this pretty cool blinking pattern that helps mimic how Electric Hurt kind of twitches in PvZ2. And you'll see what I mean once the little montage plays. So I haven't really talked about what these characters would do in game. Sunshroom, I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory. It would just produce sun, but maybe in a different kind of way. Backup Dancer is Backup Dancer. We've already seen him in GW 1 and 2, so we already know what to expect from that guy. But what about Electric Hurt? Well, I've always envisioned Electric Hurt as being tripwires. And what I mean by that is, much like in PvZ2, if you place two Electric Hurts parallel to each other, whether it be horizontally or vertically, it'll create a line, and any zombies that pass through that line will get zapped. Pretty much that, but imagine this in 3D. And it would pretty much be a placeable ability for, like, let's say cactus or something, right? So much like how Potato Mine works, this would be in a similar way where you have 4 charges of Electric Hurt. And pretty much you can place the Electric Hurts around, and much like connect the dots, you can kind of create your own interesting shape with how you place them. And any zombies that pass through these would get zapped, or maybe some kind of effect would happen to them. Probably something electric related. But the point is that it's a tripwire that you can choose the shape of. I'd imagine this would be really useful for things like garden ops, because again, really good for placing down in certain doorways and entries that the zombies pass through to get to the garden. Perhaps there's practical use for the multiplayer as well. What that could be, I'm not too sure, but I'm sure you could probably come up with something. But that was my idea for Electric Hurt. Maybe you guys could come up with something more interesting in the comments below. Like I said though, Electric Hurt was a really quick one, so that's pretty much him already done, believe it or not. So here's how he looks like in game. Now, there's this comment asking me to make Toxic Zombie, and I think that'd be a really cool character to make. It's just that unfortunately, I don't think they ever made any concept art for Toxic's. Huh.